What's up, guys? Welcome to this edition of the Whole Health with Rob Carney podcast. And on this episode, we have our very special guest, Xavi Donobedian. So Xavi is a fellow CHEK HLC2 practitioner. He's a 500-hour registered yoga teacher. He's a certified personal trainer, a CHEK exercise coach, a golf biomechanics specialist, and he is the owner of the Organic Health movement. So Xavi is originally from San Francisco, California, and he moved to Albuquerque to connect with a humble population of people looking to dive deeply in the waters of spiritual exploration. So at 14 years of age, he experienced a very punctuated shift in perspective that allowed him to view the unrest of his childhood as a gift, no matter how unpleasant or inconvenient it appeared to be. So as an obese teenager, dieting lifestyle was like an unwelcomed enemy in his life. So by integrating different aspects of his inner child that yearned to be acknowledged and heard, he has transformed the state of his well-being into a testament of love and persistence. So his desire is to share this gift of renewed loving perspective with all those he has the pleasure of meeting. So in this podcast, we had a very beautiful conversation I'm really looking forward to you guys hearing. So I hope you enjoy the podcast, and here we go. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome the one and only Xavi to the podcast. Xavi, welcome aboard.
Well, thank you, brother. Thank you for having me today.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're glad you're here. So Xavi, obviously we touched on, as we just introduced you, you've got quite the background in the holistic health world. So I'd love to hear more about your story, how you got started in this world, and how you got to where the point you are now, helping a lot of people.
Right on, man. Well, I'd love to delve in. I'll keep it short and heartfelt. I grew up as a really joyfully disposed kid. I love dancing. I love being active. And I really enjoyed myself in so many disciplines through artwork and through things that really helped me express myself. And I was always a very expressive kid. When I was about 6 or 7 years old, my parents divorced, and that created a very deep trauma for me that I ended up working through all the way from then up until now. As a means of helping me to rekindle that connection to that joyful inner child. But it took a lot of work to do so. I covered up my pain with food and sugar processed food. As a child, I had a very contentious relationship with both of my parents. I have a whole list of different extended family members that I consider to be family itself. And that is a cast of wacky and crazy characters. It has felt like I've lived in a movie for so long. But throughout those ups and downs of using food as a means of coping with pain, a feeling of being distant from my mother, who lived in New Mexico while I lived in San Francisco with my father, I really learned a lot about what it means to guide a body and what it means to be alive in a body. When I was 14 years old, after a pretty big bout of depression, after being made fun of in school, teased and taunted, feeling like an outcast, I had a pretty deep spiritual awakening that opened me up to a greater reality and a greater purpose behind the pain and trauma I'd experienced. I followed that spiritual intuition throughout the rest of my high school career, you could put it. And it really taught me a lot about being at one with one's thoughts and heart, one's way of life. And although I didn't really begin to master the side of holistic health until I was a little bit older, 19, 20, I did set a really strong foundation of introspection and inner work throughout high school and my teens that allowed me to take that spiritual energy and really integrate it into the body as I grew up. Now, of course, just because one is spiritual doesn't mean life gets any easier, but it did provide me with excellent tools to navigate the upheaval and sadness and the pain of what was to come. I went to school briefly in Boston after my father suffered 3 strokes in 3 weeks, confused, alone. A few months later, my grandfather passed away of diabetes and morbid obesity. It was a huge wake-up call to me that not only is it important to be spiritually disposed to one's life, but equally as important to be cognizant of the body, what it needs from us, cognizant of nutrition and movement. And that's really where my journey took off. And here we are on this podcast years later, where I feel like I'm walking my talk and embodying the principles I preach. And grateful to have been connected with individuals like you who have had equally intense journeys, but here we are trying to better the world as ambassadors of love and compassion for self.
Yeah, man, that's awesome. And it's funny how so many of our journeys kind of started from the great pain teacher. And I think that's where it's one of those, you got to hit rock bottom at times to really bounce back up and have that other perspective and just have that feeling, just knowing what it feels like to be in a place of dis-ease, a place of no balance, a place of lack of health, a place of anger, depression, whatever these quote unquote negative emotions we're feeling. I think we need to all feel that at some point, kind of feel that pain and sit with that pain for some time before we really have a reason to kind of change. And it sounds like for you, you have a family history of some health related problems, for lack of a better word. And for you, you said that there was some obesity within your family, including yourself. So I'd like to hear your thoughts in terms of weight loss, how you lost your own weight, your thought on the weight loss culture, and what that all entails and how that affected your life growing up.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much for the question. I heard you share a lot of valuable things there. And I'd just like to touch on what you said about sitting with pain. I think that's really relevant to what obesity and poor lifestyle habits mean to me. Personally, I've noticed that the need to cover up pain or ignore pain from a place of fear, and that directly experiencing the pain amplifies its intensity. It's what causes myself, so many others in my family, and many of those I've encountered in the world to fall into habits of addiction, to patterns of complacency with health. My greatest challenge has been to both embrace the pain and face it head on. So whether that's a feeling of unworthiness, a feeling of being inadequate compared to others, especially when it comes to body type, while being able to experience that pain and let it amplify, not let it take over and then cause further havoc in terms of addiction and lifestyle. It's a very fine line to walk, but I found the practice of breath, mindfulness, and meditation exquisitely helpful with being able to process and integrate that pain. For every ounce of pain I've experienced 2 ounces of wisdom. So when I look at my body in the mirror nowadays and still have projections of body dysmorphia and a desire to change what I see, although I've come so far, I remind myself that whatever I do see I don't like is providing me with such deep wisdom and a profound experience of life. It's better to have it around for a while and really appreciate it than trying to get rid of it.
Yeah, I think one thing that really stands out to me about you is you have great self-awareness, which I think is something that, I mean, you're even a little bit younger than I am. I think we're both on the younger ends of the spectrum for the work that we're doing, which is great. I think we have a different perspective than many of the other people who have been in this for years. I think we have a combination of that wisdom and also kind of that youthfulness to us, which I think is very powerful. And I think it's a great combination to have started on this journey at an earlier age. I mean, I started on this when I was about 17, and it sounds like you had your spiritual shift when you were 14. So it's interesting to me just the level of self-awareness you have for someone who's in their 20s like we are. So I applaud you for that. And you mentioned something about feeling unworthy and not being good enough compared to other people, not looking a certain way. So I would like to hear your thoughts on self-love, because that's becoming a very trendy word, the whole self-care, self-love. I'd like to hear your thought points, your views on that, and what you do in that world, because obviously coming from a background of obesity, I can imagine that there was not as much self-love, as you said, feeling inadequate, and all those type of other words that you use to describe your relationship with yourself in the past. So I'd love to hear your view on self-love, how you've integrated that, and what your view on that is, and how other people can use that in their own life.
Excellent question. And before I hop onto that, I just want to acknowledge you for the pragmatism and the clarity that you bring to your own health journey and your willingness to connect to other people. I think that's so paramount and vital at our young, impressionable age, to really learning to communicate and persuade others, not to rope them into a way of living, but really to communicate to them how potent and powerful it's been for us. And so I think that's one of the many reasons that we connect so well. And so before I dive into that question, I'll just acknowledge you for that.
Thank you, man. Appreciate that.
Yeah, you bet. Self-love. What an interesting topic. Nowadays, it's very trendy. Like you said, a lot of people are using self-love as a tool for healing and growing, expanding. And my experience with self-love is deep, and it involves a lot of twists and turns. But I'll keep it short. That is to say, one thing that I've really learned about self-love practice, self-love is not a tool to use to ignore the things that are opposite of self-love. So self-love is not a tool for me that I use to ignore aspects of self-hatred or self-denial. In fact, what I found to be most potent for my practice is to marry the two, which is to say, I take time to love the parts of myself that don't love me back and get to know them, nurture them, communicate with them, and ask them questions so that the relationship there and the connection between what we would call the two forces in the CHEK system is strengthened. I see a lot of social media that surrounds self-love that preaches this idea of just loving the positive aspects of ourselves, claiming that we are beautiful, acknowledging our power, taking it back. And that is a vital first step on an ever-ending climb through self-love. But I think it's very important to consider aspects of ourself don't change. And if we're coming from a place of obesity or addiction, and we're considering that we're being shown and given all these different ideas about what we should be doing, it's important to come back to our heart and to listen, to ask ourselves, what is it that you need from me, and what do you need to hear? So that may not be, I love you, or I am beautiful, or an affirmation. Sometimes that may be, I acknowledge how poorly you feel about yourself, and I hear and feel how unworthy you are. Thank you for sharing that with me, and I couldn't be more grateful that you took the time to do that. So that we're not suppressing aspects of ourselves, which in fact can be well-intended, but is the origin in my experience of addiction and obesity. Instead, we're bringing them to the surface and nurturing them like little children who need our attention and will throw fits and temper tantrums whenever they feel like it. But our practice is learning from them and remaining patient as we grow and expand, and make sure that we acknowledge that in others as well, because my experience, although I said I'll keep this brief, I just want to mention, is that a lot of the things that we take on from other people we think are our own. Experience this with my parents and my family, a deep feeling of unworthiness or fear. As I go deeper into it, I think, this may be mine as I'm feeling it, but a lot of this is not. So the more you communicate with those aspects of self, you can say, well, maybe this is my grandmother's, or maybe that was my childhood best friend. So the onus and the pressure is not on me to solve everything. It's just to be present with it.
Definitely. That was beautifully said. And something there that I think that you touched on, and the way I kind of view it is, we tend to numb. We tend to numb ourselves as opposed to digging into the deep shadows, digging into the less favorable aspects of ourselves. And I think that's kind of what you're hitting on there. I think that with the self-love, we can use that as a Band-Aid and a numbing approach where we're not really getting to the root of the problems. As you said, it's a great first step because it's all well-intentioned. But at the end of the day, we need to find those shadows. We need to go into those closets, find the deep, dark places that we're afraid of, that we're suppressing, that we're covering up, that we're numbing, whether it be through addiction or addiction to food, addiction to drugs, addiction to whatever it may be. So I would like to hear your thoughts and your experience with diving into those shadow areas. What tools and techniques do you use to dive into those areas, like the body image, areas that you found over the years were less favorable in terms of how you view them about yourself, and just areas that are difficult and challenging and things that are not readily talked about in the public narrative?
Excellent question. At the end of my response, I'll throw it back to you because I'm curious to hear your thoughts as well. For me, I notice social conditioning teaches us to suppress our truth, our honesty, and placate to others. There's a lot of social conditioning, in my experience, that requires us to be everything to everyone, and also requires us to speak sweet truths to others that we may not feel. So I think a huge aspect of the shadow is that it remains in the shadow because the light is not upon it. And the light, in my experience, is the expression of honesty and truth. So for me, when I take the time to say, all right, nobody's around me right now, and although with that last interaction that I'm not completely happy with, I didn't communicate as honestly as I could. Right now, I'm going to take the time to scream and yell and chant and do whatever it is that's really in my heart, because it deserves equal expression to the good things that I express. I notice with body dysmorphia, whether you have had a history of obesity or anorexia, bulimia, there's a narrative and a voice that gets seated very deeply within the psyche that causes one to continue to act out that self-defeating behavior, whether it be, I'm ugly, I'm unworthy, I'll never be beautiful. Those things tend to stay in the background, and the shadow is kind of begging us to pay attention to it because it needs the nurturing and the care that only our attention can offer in order to feel at least somewhat whole or somewhat acknowledged. Therefore, like I said, just speaking your truth out loud is a very powerful practice. And if that's something that may be fear-provoking, I think another thing that I've benefited from tremendously is journaling. I've come up with some truths about myself and journaling that are very hard to express, but you can just feel the emotion of them. So those two together, psychotherapy is fantastic. I think floating, which is very popular nowadays, is wonderful because your body is weightless, there's sensory deprivation, and all it is you and your heart, and you quite literally are in the shadows. I think darkness physically plays a really important part with that, where the shadow feels safe to come out. So with those things in mind, I'll turn the question back to you, and I'm curious about what the shadow means to you socially, what the shadow means to you personally, and how you navigate those waters.
Yeah, man. I first of all, I love your response, and I think it's definitely a topic that needs to be talked about more. And that's where I really hope that this podcast is something that will spread these ideas and the fact that it's okay to talk about these shadows, first of all, because I think the public narrative is that you don't talk about that stuff. If you talk about that, especially as like a man, you are weak. You talk about a guy, it's not like you don't do. The guys don't do that. We don't talk about our weaknesses. We don't be vulnerable. That's a narrative that is absurd. I mean, it's kind of just this old school macho man, like no pain, no gain. I don't show emotion, any of that type of stuff. But at the end of the day, that's gonna, as you said, it's gonna be deep rooted. It's gonna be stuck in there. We're gonna need to do a lot more work to get it out if we keep suppressing it than if we deal with it immediately. So my view on it is that it's a part of life. First of all, is that, as you mentioned, the two forces, we have the yin and the yang. We have the good and the evil, if we want to call it that. We have these aspects that are with us every waking moment. We can choose with our own perspective how we view things. And you and I can be looking at the same situation and have two very different viewpoints on it, depending on how we've been raised, our social conditioning, And whose thoughts are those in our head, as you mentioned earlier? They may not be our thoughts. You may be looking at something thinking, oh my God, that's horrible. I can't believe that person did that. I could be looking at it thinking, oh, this is beautiful. It's a beautiful day outside. And just depending on our social conditioning, I think it's really going to depend on how we look at these things and how we look at ourselves and how we've been conditioned to believe we should look or we should act or we should think. And I think, as you said, speaking your truth. When we speak our truth, and of course, first we got to find out what our truth is, but that comes with speaking more and expressing more and doing more and being more, but also on the flip side, taking the time to do less, to be less. So finding that balance of, as you said, the journaling is something I thoroughly enjoy, and it's not something I do as much as I know is good for me. I kind of go through phases, but again, I use that as a tool in my arsenal when I feel angry or any of these unfavorable emotions coming up, as opposed to suppressing them. I try to take the time to sit with them, to ask myself questions. And for me, one thing that I really enjoy and that helps kind of stir these things up is breathing, doing breath work, doing shaking, kind of going into that more primal animalistic state, kind of the, as you said, the stomping, chanting, yelling, the just making these deep noises that kind of echo up from us, stir up the vibrations within the body, shaking things up physically, mentally, kind of being a little silly, being a little crazy, and kind of letting out these emotions, because we hold a lot of tension in our tissues, in our muscles, and our joints, and all these things. So physically getting that out physically, I think, is powerful. Then doing things like meditation and journaling are a great way to get that in another way that's more on the still side. So I like to kind of use a combination of movement and doing with the combination of sitting and stillness. And one thing that I definitely found too is doing some martial arts, which I don't do nearly as much as I would like to and have not in a couple of years. But when I was doing some Muay Thai, and it's a lot of striking, and I found a lot of anger coming up. Again, a lot of suppressed anger. And sometimes I can have these flashback memories of, again, maybe a childhood memory, and be like, damn, like, why did that come up? And it was kind of as I was releasing, I'm hitting the bag, I'm sparring with someone, whatever it was, it's, you kind of feel these things stirring up, and you realize that, yeah, that's still inside of me. So the long answer to the question is finding the balance between doing, trying to do more, to be more, as in improving ourselves and getting it out physically, but also coupling that with the stillness and the doing less and the being less and the just sitting with our thoughts. So I think it's a combination of the yin and the yang. And that's kind of my approach to most things, is finding that balance of the yang, of the doing, and the yin and the stillness. And for me personally, it's something that I try to address right away. As soon as I feel these thoughts coming up in my first moment, I try to sit back. As you said, if I'll have an unfavorable conversation where I don't react quite the way I would like to someone's response, and then I can kind of take a step back and ask myself, why did I respond that way? What kind of response, why did that come up? And just ask myself questions. And again, maybe that's through the shaking or walking or sitting and journaling. So yeah, I don't think there's any short, concise answer that I can give to that. And I think we both had similar thoughts on it. Obviously, we have our own little twist based on our own experiences in life as well. But yeah, man, that's what I would go with.
Very beautifully put. I really appreciate that contribution to the conversation. What you said about doing and being elicits something that I've learned recently, really powerful axiom for continuing on our growth and expansion journey. That is doing from a place of being rather than trying to have both separate. So I think of a Zen master or a Buddhist deep in the practice who will, for example, sweep a porch or sweep the courtyard of the monastery. And they are sweeping, an action of doing, from a deep place of being and a presence that goes beyond space and time. So when you talk about really what that means for you and getting everything out, I notice we tend to one side of that equation or the other. Some people in the spiritual community are really passive and all about being, and all problems can be solved with being. There are also people in the world, maybe some entrepreneurs we are all familiar with, who are all about doing. And it's all about the hustle and nothing about any portion of stillness. I notice when we talk about suppression in myself, one thing that I do when I need to suppress is act in a really erratic and hyperactive manner. When I'm afraid of putting myself out there, I go into deep moments and times of stillness and being, which kind of creates this obsessive compulsion of spiritual focus, which can also be antagonistic to our growth. So I really like that you mentioned martial arts, because martial arts is a wonderful, wonderful example of doing from a place of being. Your strikes are purposeful. Your time is potent, and your focus is locked. And you're acting from a place of precision while also acting from a place of stillness. So thank you so much for that contribution. It's reminded me of my own desire to get back into martial arts because it really does bring up a lot. It's quite primal, as you mentioned, with the shaking. So lovely contribution, man. Thank you for that.
Absolutely, man. It's something, too, that me saying that out loud reminds me how much I need to get back into it. And, again, I do things like rock climbing, which kind of have that primal sense to them as well. But something, as you said, about the martial arts, it's just this combination of, like, a moving meditation with also exercise. It's kind of this incredible yin-yang balance, which is, I can't think of many other things. I mean, obviously, certain sports have that similar contribution. I just think that martial arts, as you said, it's very unique. And it's something that I think is very important for people to kind of find a balance of, or to at least try at some point in their life, because I feel like I'm not that I've had too much experience at all, but just in the amount of experience I've had in the martial arts, I feel like I've just learned a lot about myself and my emotions and just my physical body. Because again, you're using your physical body. You're not using any other equipment. I mean, maybe you got some gloves on or whatever, but it's, for the most part, you're very in tune with your body. You feel every strike, you feel every block, you feel every breath, because you kind of work your breath in with the movements to get the best out of what you're doing. And I think it's something too that it's something we can practice on a daily basis through things like meditation, through things like shaking, just kind of tuning into the body. Because not everyone can do martial arts. Not everyone is physically able. If we have any sort of health conditions that prevent people, I mean, obviously there's things like Tai Chi, which are much more slow movements. So I would like to know, in terms of what you do on a regular basis to kind of incorporate these mind-body principles and finding that balance within yourself. What are things that you do just about every single day that help you optimize your waking hours and sleeping hours?
Excellent question, man. Thank you so much. I've always been a very physical person, even when I was young and morbidly obese, which is a fact some of my family members may contrast because they're sweet, but my experience of self was that I was morbidly obese. I was quite large. Point being, physical activity for me, especially when you mention breath and movement, is so potent. I think many people hear our conversation of breath work and working in and things that they've heard forever from maybe a doctor or a naturopath or whatever it is, and like, yeah, whatever. I've heard about breathing. I've tried it. It doesn't work. I think when you go really deep into it, which I have, because I've had a healthy dose of skepticism around these practices, breathing and movement, if you work out and you do every exercise that you normally do, whether it's a deadlift or a kettlebell swing, a cable row, and your intent is not to focus on form or weight or reps, but you just do it with the breath, your experience is completely different. I find when we talk about the CHEK system, the respiratory function is highest on the totem pole, has influence on the viscera, the emotional system, the joints, the musculoskeletal system. your endocrine system. It's really about the breathing. So I noticed that when I overthink, when I tend to get into a position of stress, what we would call kind of in the functional medicine, the HPA axis dysregulation. So stress hormone interrupting your thyroid axis with the hypothalamus communication. Complicated, but I'll put it aside. Point being, when I take the time to go, oh my God, my body is going into a state of stress and overwhelm, I come back to the origin of what represents doing from a place of being. When I breathe through my movement, if you notice, breath is that which is present when you're still, and breath is that which is present when you're doing. It's the connecting force between the two. If you take a walk and you really use that as an opportunity to breathe, you'll see how potent your doing can become from a place of breath. And then specifically, one of the activities I love is golf. Anything golf-oriented I love because it's such a test of skill, willpower, presence, and focus. It requires a high degree of ability physically. The breath is intimately linked with the movements. So we talk about axial extension with inhalation, flexion, exhalation. And that pumping and that breathing as you walk and you get connected into nature is really profound for me for reducing stress load and also for allowing me to come center with what it is within my heart that really asks for my attention. And we all take it in different ways. You love rock climbing. That's a really powerful way to get into it. Breath work itself, just sitting and focusing on the rhythm and the flow of energy through you, huge. For some people, it could be hunting. That's quite popular within, I guess you could call the Joe Rogan community or the modern alpha male. And that practice of hunting is quite primal, quite intense, and it also requires you to be very, very present and still within yourself while executing very precise pulls of a bow, or let's just say pulls of a trigger on a gun, whatever it is, whatever way you hunt. A really wonderful way to get connected to primal roots. And I think that's where the potency of these emotions lies, and primal inclinations of the triune brain and the different parts of our body that require different modes of consciousness.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. And I think, as you said, everyone's going to have their own form of this, their own form of getting out of the head and getting into the body, per se, in terms of stress-related thinking. And everyone's going to have their preferences. Some people may like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Some people might like golfing or hunting or rock climbing or swimming or running or whatever it is. There's no right or wrong way to go about that. And I think that's an important distinction that I think tends to get overlooked, is that we kind of have the traditional view of, well, you go to the gym, you go on the treadmill for a little bit, you do the machines, then you kind of go home. And that's not effective for most people. And as you said, breath and incorporating the breath, as someone who is still 15 months later recovering from an injury that resulted from my ego pushing me through workouts and ending up fracturing a rib and tearing my rhomboid, which is, again, 15 months later, I've lost about 28 pounds of muscle, of course, some healthy fat as well. But I've been unable to really do a lot of things I love because I was not listening to my body. I wasn't in tune with my breath. I was letting my head get in the way, where I was more focused on getting the reps and getting the numbers than actually tuning in. And I think that that's not uncommon, unfortunately. And again, it goes back to the no pain, no gain mentality, which, as spiritually inclined as I can be and self-aware as I can be at times, it's easy to fall in that trap from time to time. But at the end of the day, as we started this conversation with, the great pain teacher teaches us these lessons. And now I hope for the rest of my life, I will put a lot of those numbers out the window and let my breath and body lead me first, and allow myself to listen and tune in and become more present. And it's funny because I've actually gotten to the point where I enjoy exercise without music, where before, at the time of the injury, I was headphones in, blasting music. And again, it was sometimes you lose count of the reps because you're listening to music, you're not in tune, you're kind of forgetting about the breath because there's just too much stimulus going on. So something that I've really learned from this experience is to just, one, take a step back, let the ego step aside, because the ego doesn't get us so far when it comes to things like weightlifting at times. So learning to tune into my breath, to tune into just my body. And again, not have all these inputs, not have the music blasting, and just kind of allow myself to focus on the motion, the form, as you said, the breathing. And I think if we all kind of incorporate some of those principles into our everyday life, I think we're all going to be a little bit more happy, a little bit healthier, and a little bit less stressed, because we already have so much information and input going into our brains that I think it's important to kind of take that time to let things sit and settle.
So very well said, man. Wonderful contribution again. I'll share one thing from my heart that, at times I'm highly anxious. At times it's so easy to slip into that ego drive, as you mentioned, whether it's weightlifting or our career, our family. Very easy to slip into that. And I preach self-compassion almost over self-love, because oftentimes love implies a bondage, an obligation. And I think as a culture, we're really learning now more than ever to love beyond obligation and requirement.
Yes.
Compassion is an acknowledgement of folly, an acknowledgement of shortcoming, but not from a place of pity or guilt or shame. Compassion from a place of, I've been there, I've done that, I see that in you, and I see that in me. So, somebody could listen to this, try really hard for 2 days to love themselves and do breath work and all of that. They might fall out of it. But the key to staying in it, in my experience, which has allowed me to lose weight and keep it off, is to express compassion and care for the parts of myself that want to self-sabotage, that want to say, oh, fuck that. I'm not going to listen to whoever it was online that I heard talk about health. They don't know me. They don't know my pain. And just say, you know what, you're right. And for as long as you feel that way, I'll be here for you. But I'm going to acknowledge you, not from contractual obligation, but just from a place of, hey, I know what it's like. I feel you too.
That's awesome, man. Beautifully said. And on that note, let's wrap it up with, how can people find you? You just said some amazing things that people need to be able to find you. What is the best place for people to reach you these days? Because that was beautifully said, my man.
Thank you so much, man. And everything you shared touched my heart as well. I'm on Instagram, Organic Health Movement. My website is www.organic-health-movement.com. You can find me on Facebook, Organic Health Movement, there as well. YouTube, I'm under my first name, Xavi Donobedian. You can find the links to the YouTube on my Instagram, links to the Facebook on Facebook. I think it's also on Instagram. I'll have to double check. And then if you're in the Albuquerque, New Mexico area or anywhere in the Southwest, I am situated and work out of Albuquerque.
So thank you again for listening to this episode of the Whole Health with Rob Carney podcast with our guest, Xavi Donobedian. So we had a little technical difficulties at the end there, so I just wanted to share again how to contact Xavi. So you can reach him on his Instagram at organic_health_movement, as well on his Facebook page, Organic Health Movement, and then on his website, www.organic-health-movement.com. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation we had. I know I did. We had a great time together. We always have a lot of fun when we get the opportunity to speak with each other. So please let me know what you thought of the conversation so we can continue to provide you with the best guests and the best conversations available. And as always, this podcast is brought to you by our superfood sponsors, Purium Health Products and Mushroom Revival. So Purium Health Products will be the first company of their kind to be 100% plastic free by 2021. So you can get all their organic superfoods they have there, from amino acids to green juices and sleep aids, natural sleep aids like their Apothecary, which has tons of antioxidants, and as well as natural melatonin, which I've been using to really help me get into that deep, restful sleep. And so if you go to iShopPurium.com, as well as PuriumCBD.com for their highest quality CBD on the market for the lowest price, you can use the promo code wholehealth, that's WHOLE health, all one word, to save $50 off your first order. And then Mushroom Revival with my great friend Alex Storr, the owner of Mushroom Revival there. So he has been growing and facilitating the conversation of medicinal mushrooms. So he is a pioneer in the field. He's incredibly knowledgeable about what he does, and his products are top of the line. He's one of the first to be certified organic, and he is the first certified organic cordyceps mellifluous farm in the country. So I'd love for you to check out his products as well as at mushroom-revival.com, and you can use that same code wholehealth, WHOLE health, all one word, to save 15% on your every order. So thank you again for listening. Check out those superfoods. Would love to hear your feedback of how they helped you. I've been hearing a lot of great people reach out to me saying how much they've been helping them with their day-to-day life, from energy to sleep to just overall health and well-being. So I would love for you to get similar results and would love to hear your stories. So thank you again for listening, and tune in for future episodes.